Hello and welcome back to Diddy on Trial from the BBC World Service YouTube channel with me, Anushka Mutanda. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a thing. Now, it's week 7 in the trial of Sean Diddy Combs, and the prosecution and the defence have rested their case. A reminder, he's charged with sex trafficking, transportation for prostitution, and racketeering with conspiracy. These are charges he has consistently denied. Now, later on, I'm going to be getting all the legal analysis from our resident criminal defence attorney, Sean Kent, but right now I'm with the BBC's New York correspondent, Neda Tawfiq, who's going to fill me in with what happened earlier this week. Hi, Neda. So, Neda, for the first time since the trial began, we've actually heard from Diddy in the courtroom, which was quite a big moment for us. I mean, it's something that actually happens. All the criminal defendants are offered the opportunity to take the stand and they have to get up and say what their decision is. But he had a little something else that he wanted to say.
So the judge started off by asking Diddy how he was doing, and he said he was doing great, and then included a remark about the judge's performance throughout the trial. He said, "I just wanted to let you know, thank you. You're doing an excellent job." So it gave people a little bit of insight into that part of his personality. He is known as someone who was very charismatic, tried to get people, a little bit on his side to like him, the kind of PR side of being a hip hop mogul and personality. So we got to see a little bit of that again in court because, of course, in appearance, in his dress, he's been really a far cry from that old bad boy image. So to see him get up and speak in court was really interesting. But of course, he decided not to testify. He said he did that after consulting with his lawyers, but it was his sole decision to make, and he made it.
So at the beginning of the week, we had Brendan Paul, who's been referred to as Diddy's drug mule before. He was on the stand for an hour.
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously during the raids on Diddy's homes, he was arrested at the airport. He was called a drug mule. But really, when he got on the stand, he said, look, I wasn't a drug mule, under questioning by the defense. He said, I got drugs for Diddy 5 to 10 times. Yeah, they were $1,000. I tried drugs once because I wanted to prove I was loyal, and Diddy asked me to. But ultimately, his testimony really reflected what we had heard from the other personal assistants, just how long he went without sleep, how hard he worked, how he cleaned up rooms after Diddy, which is how he ended up, according to him, with the cocaine in his bag, which he didn't realize was there when he was arrested. And so it was just another kind of witness talking about how their feelings about Diddy are complicated, but that, they were willing to do whatever he needed.
Yeah, so then we had another summary witness who was a special agent from Homeland Security, and he actually works in the terrorism division, so he's not specifically tied to this case, but he put together a summary chart for the prosecution, which was this really meticulous walkthrough of different events. What exactly was that?
Yeah, I mean, the jury, and it was really just the jury, so it was very limited who could see these, nearly 40 minutes of freak-off videos that were presented. But remember, the government has to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. So they have to, beyond just having the testimony about these freak-offs, connect other evidence to it to prove it happened. And so the chart brought up things like the hotel bookings, Ubers that were booked, text messages between, Jane and Diddy or Cassie and Diddy talking about these freak-offs, any other bit of evidence they had for each of those events to prove that it, in fact, happened, because that, of course, is a key part of this. Did this happen at all?
So then the prosecution rested their case and the defense began theirs. And they've been telling us as time's gone on that they're going to take less and less time to put on a case. But I was shocked by how long they actually took.
I mean, exactly. You went from 5 days or more to 2 to 5 days to ultimately nearly 30 minutes was the entire case. No witnesses whatsoever. Now, it was, I think, particularly striking when you think of the fact that prosecutors put forward 34 witnesses over, 6 weeks? And of course, the burden is on the government. So what it signaled was perhaps the defense wanted to show to the jury, like, look, we don't think we have to bring in other witnesses. We don't think we have to do anything because we don't feel the government has proved its case. So we're going to use our time just to continue to undermine their witnesses. And so they did that. First off, we saw more messages from Jane and Cassie that were trying to paint them again as women who were very enthusiastic about these freak-offs, speaking about, the types of sexual encounters they wanted to have, or just how much they loved them, the freak-offs. And we've heard plenty from the prosecution trying to downplay that element, saying the women felt they had to do that. And then we saw also just some evidence from some of the cross-examination. So they went through, for example, Dawn Richard. She had that comment not long after Cassie got off the stand about how Diddy told her people go missing to get her to stay silent about witnessing violence against Cassie. Well, they point out that that wasn't in other transcripts with prosecutors. Same thing with Bonna and Mia, just going through and trying to pick out how parts of what they said weren't in initial conversations.
And then there was some stuff about the commercial male sex workers, which I found really interesting because it actually picked away at the transportation for prostitution charge. So Daniel Phillips and Sheree Hayes, who we probably all now know as the Punisher, had expressed in pre-trial meetings with the prosecution that they developed romantic feelings towards Cassie.
Yeah, that's right. Romantic feelings, jealousy, when Diddy would try to kind of, tell them to step aside during the freak off, it was his turn. It was interesting with Daniel Phillips that he made a comment that he just wanted to be part of their world and he would have done this without money. So look, for prosecutors, they think the easiest charge here is transportation to engage in prostitution. So here's the defense trying to put in something to hit back at that charge, because for prosecutors, they think jurors are going to say it's pretty simple. They got money for sex, they were transported across state lines, end of discussion.
So we know we've had prosecution's closing arguments today. Tomorrow it's the defense. What happens after that, Neda?
Yeah, so certainly with opening statements, both sides have already kind of outlined their roadmap for the jury, but now they've had weeks of evidence. And so closing arguments are all about walking the jury through their case and how they've proven it. And it's a really meticulous process for both sides. I mean, it's their final chance to get the jury on their side. Cases are won or lost in closing arguments, certainly. And what makes it so important is the fact that, of course, you need a unanimous jury in this country. 12 jurors, different backgrounds, different experiences in life. They could be hearing the same evidence and coming up with different conclusions, which is, again, why closing arguments are so important. And so they're going to go into that deliberations room and start looking at those charges, and both sides will be holding their breath, hoping they did their job.
Neda, thanks so much for breaking that down for us.
My pleasure.
That was the BBC's New York correspondent, Neda Tawfik. Now it's time for all the legal analysis you could ever need. I caught up with our resident criminal defense attorney, Sean Kent, on Wednesday evening.
Hi, Sean.
Hey, how are you doing?
I'm good. I want to get your first reaction to Diddy speaking in trial for the first time and him paying the judge a little compliment. Was that something you think the lawyers would have advised him to do?
No, absolutely not. We would have gone out our way to tell him not to do that. That is him thinking that he can ingratiate himself with the court, and if the judge likes him, he'll take it easy on it. Ain't happening. It came across as awful, staged, and planned, which also tells me one of the reasons why it's very good they did not put him on the stand, because clearly he thinks he can charm people. And you saw how that worked out.
Well, that brings me to my next point. I have to say it, Sean, you were absolutely right. The defense took no longer than 30 minutes. You literally could have had a coffee break and missed it. I take it you're not surprised because you've been telling us they didn't need to put on a case at all.
Yeah, if they didn't put the client on, which, for a while we weren't sure if he was going to testify or not, but once they made the decision and telegraphed pretty clear he was not going to testify, I thought it was pretty clear they were not going to put on a very long case. It's clear that their case is going to be debunking the prosecution case. So it's just like, what's the point of putting a bunch of witnesses on? I was not surprised, not in the slightest, actually.
When a fair part of the defense was pointing out discrepancies in the prosecution's notes, are those notes taken by an independent third party, or are they taken by the prosecution?
By the prosecution and by people who work for the prosecution.
So pointing out discrepancies in the prosecution notes in those pre-trial meetings that they have, saying, for instance, if I take Dawn Richard, in the first 4 meetings she had with the prosecution over the total, I think she had 7 in the end, she didn't reference that Diddy made a comment to her saying, people who talk go missing or something to that effect, and indicating the fact that maybe people have added things on, or there are discrepancies in the stories that they've told. Could the prosecution not just come back and be like, well, it's shoddy note taking and that's it?
That's absolutely what they do, and that's why they do it on purpose. Those little forms that they call, they have somebody from the FBI or somebody who's an agent of the federal government. The form is called a DEA-6 or something of that nature, where they are supposedly write down contemporaneously what the witness says. The problem is they don't have the witness sign it. They don't have the witness look at it. Those are just their notes. So exactly what you just said has happened. Sorry, we took bad notes. This might not have been word for word verbatim of what they said. And that covers them when a witness comes on and says, I don't remember saying that. I don't think I said that. I'm not sure I said that. So that's something intentional on the federal government's part. Because think about it. They could have easily just recorded the interview. Everybody in the world has got an iPhone record function. If they really wanted accuracy, they would just stop and record it and said, here's a recording of what she said.
Surely that's not that robust of a defense if you can immediately just rebut it by saying these weren't well kept notes.
Don't forget, and everybody, we have the misnomer that they say Diddy's team did not put a case on. I disagree with that. Diddy's team did put a case on. So for argument's sake, what would have ended up happening is his entire legal team would have sat down before court and said, what is our defense going to be? And they would have done something to the effect of, we need to discredit Cassie. We need to show that Cassie was in it just as much as anybody else. We need to show that possibly these escorts, these male workers, weren't really there for the money. They were in love with Cassie. We should say that the federal government did not keep good notes. Well, guess what? And then they'd say, well, what witnesses do we need for that? Well, the witnesses are Cassie, the sex workers, and they were able to get all of the things I just set out through the government's witnesses. So we say they didn't put on a case, but technically they called about 10 witnesses who were the state's witnesses, and they got their theory of the case out of those witnesses. So they did call a case. So even though everyone's saying, oh my gosh, their defense was only 30 minutes, if you go through all of the cross-examination and getting their 30 minutes out, it's probably realistically like 2 weeks.
Yeah, but even still, have they strongly, robustly proven, if we just focus in on a central moment with the CNN video, have they robustly proven that that wasn't him trying to force Cassie back into a freak off, in your
Nope.
opinion?
No, robust, not by the phrase that you have just said, but if you take it, what the judge is going to say, is there some reasonable doubt? Is there some hesitation? Is there a reason you could pause to possibly believe this is what the defense is saying? Is there a possibility? Is there a chance you don't believe Cassie's version? Is there a possibility, a chance you don't believe these sex workers were in this? Now, under that, there's a chance that the defense has driven a truck through the door of a reasonable doubt. Remember, that's our standard. It's not a robust belief. We must believe it. It has the United States of America prove the case against Sean Combs beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the question.
Hmm.
And so as you sit there and if you ask questions, if you talk to people in the courtroom, if you check the social media parlance and you ask the question, are you 1,000,000% sure that Cassie wasn't into it? Are you 1,000,000% sure that the sex workers weren't into it? Are you 1,000,000% sure that Mr. Combs did not know for a fact that these people weren't in it? Are you 1,000,000% sure that it actually is an enterprise and everybody who worked with him were in on what he was doing? When you start asking those questions, I think it's a closer call than we think. The question is, are 12 strangers, and they are strangers to each other, going to universally agree on all the charges that Mr. Combs knew for a fact what these women wanted based upon their text messages that were presented as evidence? I'm not saying they will or they're not saying they won't, but that's going to be the question. And then you run into people in different walks of life, and I don't care who you are, there's going to be some women also on the jury who are going to be repulsed by the behavior of Cassie and so forth, and also going to be repulsed by the behavior of Sean Combs. It's going to be a interesting jury room. That's the room that I wish I could be in to see the logic and analysis that this jury comes with. Because remember, we send them back there, we give them charges, but we don't give them instructions on how they come up with their decision. We just sit in there and say, y'all go argue.
Do we ever get transcripts of their
Nope.
time in? Wow.
You will never know how they came up with their decision. And the wild part about it is everybody thinks they know everything. I've talked to a lot of juries. You think you're winning, you think you won for a specific reason, that jury will come back with a reason you will be shocked by, because they bring different walks of life. They're different people. They're not all the same. So the reasons they come up with may not be the reasons you come up with or the reasons I come up with. And here's the other thing. You didn't see those freak off videos. I didn't see the freak off videos.
Yeah,
But
that's
those
true.
12 people watched the freak off videos, and I don't
Yeah.
know what they saw, but they saw them and we didn't. So we don't know what they're thinking.
And remind me, does it have to be a unanimous decision from the jury?
100%. Everybody has got to vote unanimously if there's a guilty or not guilty. And if one person says, and this is the thing, if one person says, we believe that he is not guilty, he doesn't go free. They got to do it all again.
Aren't your chances at prosecuting that to the same level massively diminished because all of the witnesses that you've called are going to be very frustrated that they have to do it all again?
Well, and I've seen a number of retrials, and everybody always says the same thing. A retrial goes better for the federal government than it goes for the defense, because the federal government now knows what the defense questions are going to be of every witness, what the text messages are going to be. They'll be able to go and talk to the jury. Like some of the jury are going to say, I guarantee you, we thought it was weird that the government didn't give us all of the text messages. They just gave us the ones that were hurting. What were they trying to hide? So maybe in the next trial, if there is one, if there's a hung jury, the federal government says, let's tell them everything. Let's not pick and choose. But yes, it's almost always the second trial, if there is one, is better for the United States of America.
Yeah. Well, as this has been going on, as always, we're getting tons and tons of questions. We've had some in the same lieu that have come up over and over again. I think we have a voice note to play in.
Ooh, I love voice notes.
Hi, I'm Rianne from Staffordshire, and a question that I keep thinking whenever I'm listening to the podcast is, why isn't there a charge for domestic violence? It seems like everyone is pretty much in agreement that he did domestically abuse Cassie at certain points, and yet that charge isn't there. I would have thought that the more charges, the better. So, yeah, I'm really hoping you can answer that because I'm so confused.
It's a
What a
fair
great question.
Yeah.
Very good question. There's a couple of ways to answer that. One, there is no federal domestic violence charge. There's no such thing under the federal statute for domestic charge, so they couldn't have charged that if they wanted to. Two, in the state of California, where this occurred, there is what's called a statute of limitations. So when Cassie brought her lawsuit and did all these other stuff, he could not be prosecuted criminally for everything that he saw in the video. That's why he was so willing to admit the stuff that he's done. And that's why the defense was willing to admit that he is a domestic abuser, because he cannot be charged for it and he cannot be charged in California for it. So even if they wanted to, they could not. And a lot of folks believe, and I think this is going to be part of the defense, the whole reason this case came forward was because of that civil lawsuit that she brought, because he couldn't be prosecuted criminally anywhere for the actions that he committed on that video. What a great question.
Yeah, and further from that, I think the one, we've spoken about this before, but I think the one that people struggle with a lot is there are some other really horrific alleged crimes in this, particularly the rape that's been alleged by Mia and Cassie. Is it the same for that? If the jury believe that he might have committed those rapes, but not the sex trafficking, what happens?
He's not charged with it. He's literally not charged with it. And there is not the federal charge for that based upon the time, which is concerning, if you will, but it's beyond concerning if the jury finds that he has committed that, but they can't find him guilty of something underlying that. That is concerning.
So will they be able to voice that? Will they say, well, we haven't determined sex trafficking, we think this?
Nope. They're giving a jury form on that. They're giving a verdict form. On that verdict form, they're allowed to check guilty, not guilty, proven, not proven, and that's it. They are not allowed to give opinion, commentary. What do you think? Why did you do that? Until after they are done, and then later people can interview them and talk to them, but it does not affect what happens in that case.
And quickly, one last time, we've had so many questions again, and I think this is important because we're going to see the civil lawsuits ramping up once this federal trial is wrapped up. There have already been a few filed today. The difference between civil lawsuits and this federal case?
Easiest way to describe it is now we're starting to understand our little legal phrases. Criminal charges they must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. So prosecutors bring cases that are I want to say easier to prove because they understand you must have it stronger evidence to prove. A civil case is preponderance of the evidence, more likely than not. And so, in civil cases are about getting money. Criminal cases are about jail time, incarceration. Um, that's the big difference in the two. So, a lot of times when people are bringing these civil lawsuits, federal prosecutors have scoured and looked at all these civil lawsuits and they realize we can't prove those allegations beyond a reasonable doubt. So, we're not bringing them. We can't prove that those allegations actually happened. We're not bringing them. In the civil arena, however, you can look and say, you know what? It is more likely than not he did blank. It is more likely than not he caused blank. And that's when you end up getting your money. So one is about money, one is about freedom, one is easier to prove, one is harder to prove. And criminal charges should be harder to prove. Why? Because we're putting someone's freedom at stake and putting them in jail, and we don't want that to be easy. So we make sure if you're bringing criminal charges, it's hard for the United States of America or whatever state to get you.
And finally, I know you are the absolute expert on this. We have closing arguments. We've spoken about this. You weren't best pleased that they're going to be 4 hours long each. What do you think?
And as we've talked about, this is, like I said, I'm no expert. I don't know if there's an expert on closing argument, but this is something that I teach on around the country. Frequent guest lecturers on closing arguments. The purpose of a closing argument, believe it or not, is to entertain and convince. That jury has been sitting around in a trial for a long period of time. Sometimes you've heard closing arguments called summations. Our job is to sum up what you've just heard in a short, succinct, entertaining way. I tell people when we teach this subject, there's two things you need to focus on. When you are talking to a jury, the big thing I'm big on don't using notes. Why? Because if something is passionate, if something is important to somebody, you don't need notes. When you have notes in front of you, that tells the jury you don't really believe in what's going on. And if you check TikTok, if you check Instagram, if you check this podcast, people don't need notes to tell you everything they think about the Diddy case. So why should a prosecutor or a lawyer? Two, jurors have a small window of attention. So do all of us. If you go to, again, Instagram or TikTok, there's a little thing on there, and I tell people to look at it. You can look how long the average person watches something. The average person does not watch videos for 4 dang hours. They don't. They lose their attention span. So a lot of times they black out. So what we have to do when we're giving a closing argument is to be the most interesting, the most compelling, and you have to make that jury look at you, listen to you, like you, and believe in you. And if it takes you 4 hours to do it, it ain't going to work.
And could this be the defense trying to claw back some time, saying, oh, well, we only presented a 30-minute defense, but here's another 4 hours where we put our case forward?
Yes and no, but 4 hours is just not going to do it. Like I'm telling you, if you and I have talked, movies, people watch movies, people enjoy movies. There's no person who sits down. The Avengers was one of the great movies in history. And even the people who wrote it came up with it and said, we need to break this down. Nobody's going to sit here and watch this for 4 hours. And those people paid for tickets. And they had to split it up to 2 hours and 2 hours. I believe the longest closing argument should be an hour. 30 to 45 minutes should be plenty of time for you to get your point across. Even from the defense standpoint, there's a movie, My Cousin Vinny. My Cousin Vinny made it. It seems like exaggerating, but the character in that movie, in response to the government, basically said everything that guy said was BS. That's a closing argument. Simple to the point that said, we don't believe anything that those guys say. That's the way that you can close. You can be simple and to the point and make sure that jury goes back there in the back and says, I don't believe the United States of America, or the other way. What a compelling, emotional case that the United States just put on.
Sean, thank you so much once again.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was criminal defense attorney Sean Kent from South Carolina. And that's it for this episode of Diddy on Trial from the BBC World Service YouTube channel with me, Anushka Matanda-Dowty. Make sure you keep sending us your questions on WhatsApp at +44 330 123 551. That's +44 330 123 551.